1996 and seeing something no one could explain. Not a bird, not a balloon, a machine, metallic, lantern strung along its side, hovering above your town, silent as a held breath.
I've never
Hundreds
seen such a thing.
swore they saw it. Newspapers named it the airship. For months, it drifted across America, then vanished without a trace. What was it? A secret invention? A hoax? Or something not of this world? Welcome to the Nightshift Chronicles, where history's strangest secrets come alive in the quiet hours of the night. If you caught our last episode, you'll remember the chilling disappearance of the Flannan Isles lighthouse keepers, an event that began as a private tragedy but grew into a public legend. Tonight, we shift from sea to sky, turning our gaze to another enigma that haunted an earlier age. And before we dive in, a quick shout out to all of you watching on the night shift. Whether you're working late or just can't sleep, this channel is built for you. Drop a comment below with the time and place you're tuning in from. We love seeing the map of our night owl community grow. Now, tonight we revisit a mystery that haunted the skies long before UFOs became part of our imagination. The Great Airship Mystery of 1896-1897. America, 1896. Before the century turned and the rights left the ground, the country was already humming like a workshop after dark. Telegraph keys clicked in depots where one lamp burned late. Dynamo rooms thrummed behind brick factory walls. In kitchens and barns, on back porches, and in rented storefronts, ordinary people melted solder, shaved gears, and filed patents by lamplight. The nation was sleepless, restless, and convinced that the next great idea could be built with two good hands and a borrowed vice. In the papers, you could feel it. Columns celebrated ingenious contrivances and home-built marvels tucked between ads for bicycle sprockets and mail-order coils. Scientific magazines drew diagrams you could copy at your bench. Vacuum pumps, electric bells, improved carburetors. There were traveling lecturers with boxes of lenses and wires who promised to make lightning in a hall. County fairs gave ribbons to chicken pluckers and threshers that saved a man an hour. The patent office was a factory of hopes, and the postman's bag bulged with blueprints. That spirit did not belong only to famous names. Edison and Bell were signposts, proof that an apprentice with a notebook could change the world. But the creed of tinkering had spread to clerks, farmhands, machinists, school teachers, and boys who saved for a year to buy a second-hand lathe. In towns where gas lights still hissed and horse hooves struck sparks on stone, rumor said a neighbor down the road was fitting a motor to a kite. A blacksmith in the next county had welded a frame for a flying carriage. Someone's cousin swore he'd seen a silk envelope stitched as tight as a drum, ready to be filled with gas. Night was the natural hour of it. The day belonged to wages, the night belonged to experiments. You could stand outside a shed and hear little bursts of sound, a belt catching, a wheel taking, a sputter as a burner found its breath. Windows flashed white when an arc snapped. Somewhere a hand-cranked magneto made the air taste metallic. And if you worked nights yourself, switching trains, tending furnaces, guarding a yard, you learned to watch the sky between chores the way a machinist watches a dial. It was easy to imagine that the sky might answer. Americans had grown up on balloons and exhibitions. They had seen daring aeronauts drift over fairs and town greens, swinging in wicker baskets under swaying envelopes painted with stars. They knew the smell of coal gas and varnish, the way silk crackled in cold air, but balloons wandered where the wind sent them. What people dreamed of, what tinkerers promised in notebooks and on saloon napkins, was control. A craft with a keel, a ship with a rudder, something that could point itself like a locomotive on the rails and go where its maker willed. Abroad, rumors fed the appetite. In Paris, a Brazilian prodigy experimented with small-powered dirigibles. In Germany, engineers whispered about frameworks of aluminum and silk that might one day cross a continent. If such things were talked of in cafes and academies, why couldn't some quiet American crew, funded by a mill owner or a syndicate of merchants, already have done it in secret? Why couldn't they be testing it right now, away from prying eyes, over fields where a stray light would be taken for a star? Newspapers loved that notion. An unsigned letter would arrive at an editor's desk hinting at aeronautical gentlemen in a hangar hidden in the hills. Another would claim that a patent had been filed under a clerk's cousin's name to keep rivals confused. Editors printed it all. Skepticism on Monday, wonder on Tuesday. And the country read both with equal pleasure. The line between reporting and theater grew thin. It didn't matter. A nation of tinkerers wanted to believe that the age of air was already aloft, and that someone like them had raised it. There was another fuel besides kerosene and acetylene: money. Industrialists had learned that a bold claim could move a stock, and inventors had learned that a column inch could bring a backer to your door. Demonstrations by invitation only. Some notices hinted. Private trials after sundown. Secrecy became a sales pitch. If you saw a glow behind a mill roof at midnight, was it a lantern in a watchman's hand, or proof that a promised demonstration had just leapt the fence of possibility? Set the scene in your mind. A small town under a cold sky. Smokestacks black against the stars. A depot clock clicks toward midnight. Two telegraphers trade a last joke and step outside to cool their eyes. Out beyond the tracks, a low, steady light appears. Too bright for a farmhouse window, too even for a lantern swinging on an arm. It moves not with the wind, but as if choosing. One man whispers, "Searchlight?" The other shakes his head. There are no searchlights in this county. The light tilts, holds, and slides along as if a pilot had pulled back on an unseen lever. And if there is a shape behind it, long, dark, and cigar-like, you see it only when the light catches its edge. Skeptics had their lists ready. Venus, meteors, a fire balloon set loose by boys, a prank with a lantern and a kite string. All tidy explanations in daylight, and sometimes true. But the reports did not confine themselves to a single county or a single prankster's reach. Night after night, across hundreds of miles, people wrote down what they thought they'd seen, and what they wrote kept rhyming. A hull, a beam, a deliberate motion, a murmur like machinery, a bar of shadow crossing stars. That rhyme found an echo in workshops. If you had labored for months over a governor valve, if your neighbors had watched you test a burner and cough in the fumes, then the first time a light carved the heavens like a saw blade, you were ready to believe it had teeth. You were predisposed to think someone, somewhere, had finished the machine you could only sketch. The mystery rode on that readiness like a keel rides water. Even the language bent to fit the moment. We borrowed a word from harbors and gave it to the sky. Airship. A term built to carry weight. Engineers' weight. Investors' weight. the weight of a future that had finally found its shape. The word itself felt balanced, as if a craft could cruise on it. So when the first clusters of sightings arrived, from California valleys and prairie towns and cities where streetcars sparked blue fire as they rounded corners, the nation listened with more than idle curiosity. It listened with tools on the bench, with sleeves rolled, with the conviction that the age around it was not finished being invented. A nation of tinkerers looked up and saw perhaps not a miracle, but a prototype. That is the world into which the Great Airship Mystery was born. A world that stayed up late, that believed the next sound outside might be a belt catching or an engine firing, and that if a light crossed the sky with purpose, some clever crew of Americans had finally mastered the air. The question that followed, asked in kitchens and shops, whispered on platforms and shouted in bar rooms, was not simply what is it, but who's behind it. Was the builder a showman courting headlines, a genius hiding a patent, a consortium testing in secret, or something else entirely? The nation sharpened its pencils and its senses. The nights grew watchful. And the stories began. It began in the far west, under the open vault of California skies. Clear nights over orchards and clapboard towns brought whispers of something impossible. A long, cigar-shaped craft that drifted above rooftops, holding steady like a hawk at roost. Farmers stepped out to check the irrigation ditches and found themselves staring upward, mouths half open, as a light skimmed silently over the rows. Then the reports traveled north, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, lumber camps and mill towns, where men who lived by the saw and the shift whistle knew the difference between a falling ember and a moving light. They watched as something crossed the firmament with the deliberation of a hand drawing a straight line. The story moved eastward with uncanny rhythm, as if the sightings themselves kept pace with the telegraph keys that tacked out the news. From town to town, like sparks leaping a wire, the legend carried. One editor laughed off the tale as lanterns on the wind and printed it anyway. Another headlined it as aerial visitors, just to sell the next day's sheet. Skeptics scoffed, but night workers listened harder. Telegraph operators, train switchmen, men at water pumps and furnaces, people whose jobs required judging distances in the dark at a glance, they leaned forward at their posts, trained eyes scanning the horizon, waiting to catch sight of a glow that didn't match any star they knew. For them, it wasn't idle fantasy. A false signal could wreck a train. A misjudged gleam could mean disaster. So when these men said they saw a steady light cruising above the rooftops, silent, patient, purposeful, their words carried a weight no headline alone could dismiss. The airship legend was no longer confined to rumor. It had taken root in the worknight of the American West, and with each report, it spread like fire riding the wind, pushing eastward across the map and into the nation's imagination. Believers found their footing not in stars or imagination, but in sound. Not poetry, but the language of shop floors and machine sheds. Witnesses spoke of gear teeth catching, the sure bite of metal locking into place, of a propeller's rhythm carrying on the night wind, of a rudder trimmed against invisible headwinds, its faint groan bending through the dark like a ship steering into a storm. Some swore they heard voices, not shouts, not chaos, but calm, clipped exchanges. The tone of a crew making decisions, weighing headings, choosing their next move. One farmer told a story repeated across counties, a bucket lowered on a line swaying in the moonlight, a polite voice requesting water for the journey, then the rope snapping taut, lifting skyward, and the vessel itself rising, not like a balloon drifting aimlessly, but like a balloon that had learned to think. To skeptics, it reeked of tavern smoke and tall tales. But to the practical, the blacksmith, the mill hand, the machinist, it smelled of operations. For them, these were not fancies, but the early murmurs of a technology just beyond reach. An engine overhead, beating a rhythm their own hands understood. And if such machines existed, then someone, somewhere, was already flying the future. The American newspaper was a living machine in 1896 and 1897, noisy, relentless, always hungry for ink and drama. A story like the airship was perfect fuel. Headlines screamed across mastheads. Mysterious craft haunts the night skies, and strange apparition stalks our towns. Some papers mocked the sightings, branding them as superstition dressed up in modern clothes. Others marveled, treating the craft as if it were the dawn of a new age of flight. And still others, eager to outdo their rivals, spun the accounts into stranger shapes, stitching rumor onto fact until the stories themselves became larger than the witnesses who told them. But through the noise of headlines and the competitive scramble of presses, a quieter refrain persisted. Ordinary people insisted they had seen something. They weren't poets. They weren't dreamers. They were workers of the night, men and women whose professions relied on a keen eye and practical judgment. Rail yards where brakemen watched the horizon. Mills where engineers measured efficiency by the turn of a wheel. Telegraph stations where operators mapped the movement of sparks across the nation. They swore the light in the sky was not a star. It moved with purpose, stopped when it wished, and seemed guided by hands unseen. If there was mass imagination at work, it wasn't a fanciful one. It was technical imagination. Rivets, rigging, rudders, gearboxes. America's working class looked upward and filled the unknown with the tools they knew best. To them, the airship was no ghost or myth. It was a machine. As the stories multiplied, they began to give the airship a human face. Reports told of windows glowing in the hull, silhouettes moving behind the glass. In one town, a bowler-hatted gentleman was said to have leaned from a cabin window, raising 2 fingers in greeting before vanishing back into the dark. Other tales were stranger still. Farmers in Kansas claimed a craft descended onto their prairie, landing so gently it barely bent the grass. The pilot stepped out, exchanged a few polite words, then boarded again. Before a crowd could gather, the ship rose silently into the night. These details offended common sense. They belonged more to folklore than to engineering, and yet, curiously, the pattern held. The craft appeared to move with intent. It lingered, it maneuvered, it engaged. Navigation, not drift. Were some of these embellishments the work of eager editors? Almost certainly. Newsprint was a theater, and characters drew readers as much as machines. But even once you strip away the fanciful touches, the smiles, the hats, the conversations on the prairie, something remains. A recurring image of a vessel that behaved as if it were under command. For skeptics, these pilots were the weakest link in the story. For believers, they were its most compelling detail. Because if there were pilots, then the airship was not an illusion, it was a creation. And creations always have creators. By the spring of 1897, the mystery no longer belonged to isolated farmsteads or lonely night watchmen. The map of America itself began to glow. Reports streamed in from Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, steady enough, consistent enough, that even skeptics began to take notice. Children were told by their parents, "Wake us if the lights return." Sheriffs mounted horses and rode into the dark, their lanterns swinging as if chasing ghosts. Telegraph offices buzzed with chatter. Seen again in Quincy, lamps over Omaha, headed east before dawn. Some accounts even suggested multiplication, not one vessel, but several. One craft coursing due east, another drifting south by east, their lamps burning steady like buoys on a black sea. The fever was no longer confined to rumor. Communities adjusted their nights to the possibility of sighting. Farmers paused their plows. Ministers wrote sermons about wonders in the heavens. And in parlors, depots, and boarding houses, a new question took root. Not what is this thing, but who is doing this? If machines were flying, then men were behind them. And if men were behind them, where were they working? What hand had stitched lamps, rudders, and gears into something that could command the skies? For the first time, the airship was not merely a curiosity, it was an accusation. Somewhere, someone in America had conquered the air, and they were letting the nation watch. As the Midwest skies filled with rumors, a theory took hold that soothed some nerves and unsettled others. Perhaps, somewhere in the shadows of America, an inventor had already solved the riddle of flight. Not in daylight, not in open competition, but in guarded barns, locked warehouses, or secret back rooms where patrons paid for silence as much as progress. America had no shortage of such men, tinkerers, machinists, engineers who straddled the line between brilliance and obsession. Some worked with eccentric patrons, industrialists who liked to keep one project off the books, a workshop behind a mill, a hangar built in a field, a rented barn kept shuttered even in summer. It would take only one to build a craft that could rise, steer, and vanish back into the night. If the airships were real, then secrecy explained their timing. They flew at night when the winds were calmer, yes, but also when fewer eyes could record the truth. Lamps were hooded, engines ran at half throttle, and always there was retreat, a sudden climb into clouds, a descent into woods, a silence broken only by crickets. And what if one had fallen? Its materials might look alien, not because they were from another world, but because they were new alloys, strange joints, experiments never before seen in the open. Enough to leave farmers baffled, editors suspicious, and officials suddenly very quiet. For some, this theory was thrilling, American ingenuity a step ahead of its time. For others, it was far more unsettling, because if the airships were built by hidden hands on American soil, then why the secrecy? Why were they flying over farms and rail yards at night instead of claiming daylight and glory? By April 1897, the mystery had rolled south into Texas, where wide skies left no place for a secret to hide. Here, plain talk met big horizons. Farm hands leaned on fence rails and pointed at drifting lights, swearing they moved against the wind. Telegraph operators paused at their keys, watching for long shadows crossing the face of the moon. The airship became a neighbor in local gossip, discussed in boarding houses, barbershops, and courthouse steps. Some dismissed it with a grin. Others leaned closer, their voices dropping, as though speaking too loud might summon it overhead. The strange reports multiplied. A ranch hand in Denton swore he saw lamps swinging beneath a dark hull. In Waxahachie, a preacher told his flock the machine was a warning, a sign to repent. And in Decatur, a crowd claimed to watch an airship land in a pasture, only to lift again before anyone could cross the field. But then a headline in a small town paper drew a circle around itself: Aurora. What happened there would forever change the story. Not just sightings, not just rumor, but something tangible, something that seemed to fall out of the sky and land squarely in legend. The Aurora account was simple, and perhaps for that reason it lingers like a ghost. A craft was said to have flown low over the prairie and clipped a windmill on the property of Judge J.S. Proctor. The impact shattered the structure, scattering wreckage across the yard. In the silence that followed, townspeople came to see for themselves. The machine, they said, did not look like anything known to the day. Bits of unfamiliar metal lay among the debris, strange alloys that bent or fractured in ways local smiths couldn't place. The pilot, if that was even the word, did not survive. Witnesses described the remains as slight, unearthly, perhaps more fragile than human. The community, practical and pious above all, treated the body with dignity. They gave it a burial in the local cemetery, a grave for a stranger from nowhere. What made the story endure was not elaborate detail, but the absence of it. No inventor's name, no patent sketches, no carnival showman taking credit, just a small town paper calmly recording what neighbors swore they saw. And then came the line that stuck like a burr, the phrase that would echo across generations. The pilot was not of this world. Aurora did not ask for the legend, but it was given to them. From that day forward, the town would be visited by seekers, skeptics, and believers alike, armed with tape measures, cameras, and questions. The little cemetery became less a resting place than a landmark, marked by whispers and speculation. Aurora had become more than a town on the map. It had become the center of a myth that would not die. In the decades that followed, Aurora became less a town and more a site of pilgrimage. Historians came with notebooks. Skeptics came with shovels and questions. Believers came with flowers. All of them walked the same cemetery path, pausing before the unmarked ground where locals swore the pilot had been laid to rest. Some visitors claimed to find fragments of odd metal, twisted, brittle, strangely light in the hand. Others found only dust and disappointment. A grave marker once stood, then disappeared, as though erased by time itself. Each absence added weight to the mystery. Petitions were filed to dig deeper, to exhume the site and put the story to rest. But every request met the same polite wall: refusal. The town elders insisted that sanctity had its own gravity, and the grave was not theirs to disturb. The ground kept its secrets. The tale kept its pulse. If it was a prank, it was a patient one, surviving generations without confession. If it was truth, it was stingy with proof, offering only glimpses, never surrender. Aurora became a paradox, a place where silence spoke louder than evidence, and where refusal to dig only deepened the hole in history. Skeptics assembled their ledger with care, column by column. The planet Venus, low and bright on clear nights, had tricked the eyes of countless skywatchers before. Balloons, still uncommon, but not impossible, drifted in from fairs or private experiments. Traveling searchlights, novelties in the age of electricity, threw moving beams across clouds that could mimic motion. And, perhaps most convincing of all, the press itself. Newspapers thrived on rivalry. One paper scoffed, another exaggerated, a third tried to outdo them both. Circulation climbed on spectacle, and truth could be elastic, stretched as easily as a showman's smile. But the ledger, tidy as it looked, kept running into resistance, not in the claims of lights alone, but in the stubborn vocabulary repeated across towns and states. Rudders, propellers, gearboxes, winches. Words lifted not from poetry, but from the shop floor. These were not the phrases of dreamers. They were the language of mechanics, men and women who lived by the rhythms of machines. Perhaps the sky was nothing more than a canvas onto which America's restless industrial imagination projected its next frontier. But the possibility lingered, an irritant to reason, that something more than imagination passed overhead, a shadow with weight, structure, and command. The skeptics had their reasons, the witnesses had their words, and between them the mystery refused to close. Even if no workshop ever produced it, the airship meant something. It was more than rumor, it was a reflection, a mirror held to a nation restless with invention. Trains were shrinking distance, telegraphs were shrinking time, and industry was bending iron and fire into every corner of daily life. Why shouldn't the skies be next? The wave of 1896 and 1897 unfolded at a crossroads where engineering met myth. A country of tinkerers, dreamers, and mechanics looked upward and projected its own longing into the night. What they thought they saw, gliding lanterns, whispering propellers, shadowed hulls, was less about what was there and more about what they hoped would be. The sky became a rehearsal stage for the future, lit by imagination as much as machinery. And then, a few years later, the future answered. On a sandy stretch of Carolina coast, the Wright brothers bent air itself to their will. Documented, photographed, measured, undeniable. The machine age took flight not in whispers, but in proof. Yet, the mystery of the airship did not vanish. It lingered in small-town archives, in family stories, in the margins of folklore. Neither solved nor fully dismissed, instead, it rests in that peculiar American category, unsettled. The airship was never only about flight. It was about possibility, the belief that the next horizon was already within reach, waiting for hands clever enough, daring enough to seize it. Ask around in towns small enough to still remember themselves, and you'll hear the story whispered. A long shape above the trees, lamps strung in careful order, a sound like a machine learning to breathe. Perhaps nothing extraordinary passed overhead in 1897, only the American imagination, restless and wide awake. Or perhaps someone flew before it was time and vanished without needing applause. This has been the Nightshift Chronicles, where the long hours bring history's most haunting questions. Until next time, Stay awake, stay aware, and remember to look up. You might witness something incredible.